I'm here with Dr. Gundry, who is an internationally recognized inventor, researcher, and one of America's top doctors. His belief and theory of the way our brain computes eating habits has led to his foolproof system of eating that result in weight loss and certain serious diseases. He is a former researcher at Yale University and has held a director role, including head of division of cardiothoracic surgery. Dr. Gundry has written more than 200 articles and books about cardiac surgery, the nutritional reversal of heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, and hypertension. Currently, Dr. Gundry is the director of the International Heart and Lung Institute in Palm Springs, California, and the founder director of the Center for Restorative Medicine in Palm Springs and Santa Barbara. The reason I have him on today is because he's on the cutting edge of research in lectins and their role in autoimmune conditions. Very few people are really researching this, and he published a paper which I read that I scanned through the research, and it was the only paper I could find looking at lectins and people. Sure. Everything else was like animals maybe, and you didn't really know what was going on. This was a real paper. I knew he's going to have a lot of insights, and I want to pick his brain today. So first, how did you get into the research of lectins and autoimmune disease?
Great question. So I was chairman of cardiothoracic surgery at Loma Linda University for many years. And I was one of the pioneers with my partner Leonard Bailey on pediatric and infant heart transplantation. And we pioneered xenotransplantation, which is basically taking a pig into a baboon or a baboon into a human. And so to do that, we had to become really conversant and knowledgeable in transplant immunology. The reason was that we wanted to fool the immune system, and we had to learn what the immune system was interested in, and then we had to learn how to fool it. We got very good at it. I actually still hold the record for the longest pig to baboon heart transplant in the world, 28 days with conventional immunosuppression. The previous record was 5 hours. So not a bad record.
No small feat. No small feat.
Okay. So about 15 years ago, I got turned on that heart disease could be reversed with food. And as a very famous heart surgeon, I figured that was actually a really good thing to do. So I started experimenting on myself, and at that time I was about 70 pounds overweight and had prediabetes and hypertension, even though I was running 30 miles a week and going to the gym 1 hour every day. And all those things reversed in me. And I started doing this on my patients who I had actually operated on. And not only their cholesterol problems reversed and their heart disease reversed, but their arthritis went away and their diabetes went away. So after about a year of this at Loma Linda University, I decided to resign my position and set up an institute in Palm Springs where I could teach people basically how to reverse disease with food and supplements. And that actually resulted in my first book, which was called Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. And after that book was published, a lot of people with autoimmune diseases began showing up in my office from around the world. And they said, "Hey, what do you know about autoimmune disease?" And I said, "Well, I don't really know much about autoimmune disease, but I know a lot about how the immune system works. So why don't we start playing, if you'll allow me?" And I view every patient as their own research project and my research project. So as years have gone by, we've begun to get very sophisticated tests on looking at inflammatory cytokines and other hormones. And I started, every 3 months, I would begin getting these tests on every one of my patients and getting a very interesting history on people. And the first thing that popped up was people who had hypothyroidism, particularly Hashimoto's hypothyroid, or were told that that's what they have, always had a elevated hormone called adiponectin. And I thought that was pretty interesting because if you look at the diabetes literature and you look at the cardiovascular literature and the obesity literature, if adiponectin is low, then that's considered to be a bad thing. But if adiponectin levels are normal or even high, then that's considered a very good thing. And yet, if you look a little bit deeper, the Harvard nurses study showed that thin women with elevated adiponectin levels had a very high incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And that doesn't make any sense. And these were people who were screened for the ApoE4 gene, so you couldn't account for it with that. And finally, as I kept digging, like you dig, you find papers that people with rheumatoid arthritis have high levels of adiponectin. And I said, son of a gun, maybe this is the marker I'm looking for, because every human being who's hypothyroid that I've studied has an elevated adiponectin level. And there were a number of people who had elevated adiponectin levels who weren't hypothyroid. So I started looking for other markers, inflammatory cytokines, that might tell me when somebody was eating something or was interacting with a food. And that's when, in a way, I stumbled on TNF-alpha, which is tumor necrosis factor alpha. It's a major inflammatory cytokine. And lo and behold, these people with elevated adiponectin levels, for the most part, had elevated TNF-alpha levels. So now I had another piece to the puzzle. So I can stop there and take a breath if you want.
Yeah, well, that's all very interesting. Yeah. So I've actually been studying adiponectin a little, and it's a weird hormone. I mean, it's released from fat cells,
yep.
And it causes you to lose weight. It's a weight loss hormone in a way, I guess. It activates AMPK, which is a metabolism. It's an anti-inflammatory. So it does a whole bunch of good things, but on the other hand, like you said, especially with lectins, it's coming out high. Why would that be that it's coming out high when it's a good hormone? What is it about lectins that causes it to go higher?
My personal feeling is that it's actually a marker that not only are lectins getting through tight junctions of the enterocytes, but also the lectins, and we can talk about that, are allowing those tight junctions to break. And not only do lectins head into the interstitium, but also bacterial particles. Not only whole bacteria, but more importantly, probably lipopolysaccharides, LPSs. I don't swear as a general rule, but I can't resist calling LPSs little pieces of shit, because that's actually what they are. They're the cell walls of gram-negative bacteria. And what my theory is that our immune system in the adipose tissues around the gut are the first sensors of this bacterial invasion. And I actually think that adiponectin is a pretty good marker that something is wrong with the gut wall. And you can call it leaky gut if you want to. But somehow permeability of the gut wall is different in these people. Now, whether that's a genetic predisposition, I think genes have a lot to do with this, because when I take a family history of people who have autoimmune diseases, they have a remarkably interesting family history, not only of irritable bowel, thyroid issues, MS, Crohn's disease, colitis, lupus, but they also have actually a very strong family history of lymphomas and leukemias. And it's amazing when you start putting these family trees together, how much of this there is a genetic component. Does there have to be? No, and we can go into that. But
what is it about the gut lining that one person's genes, if you asked me, I would say maybe it has to do with toll-like receptors 4, especially they're activated by lectins, and LPS. But it seems like what I've noticed, I deal with clients who almost always are lectin sensitive. And that manifests by like being tired after eating lectin foods and things like that. And what I notice is that whenever people have a large bout, a really stressful period, that really triggers lectin sensitivity. And my theory is actually that certain stress hormones like corticotropin-releasing hormone causes a permeable gut. Is that something that you looked into or that you would be able to comment on?
Well, it's interesting. Most of these people that we study have absolutely normal AM cortisol levels. We actually rarely see elevated cortisol levels in these people, which goes against the current, cortisol is the cause of all weight gain, or leptin is the cause of all weight gain. I take care of, 10,000 people, and I've probably seen an elevated leptin level in maybe 20 of them. And cortisol, I do see cortisol elevations, but it's not necessarily in lectin-sensitive people. But you're right, stress clearly can change the gut barrier. And all you have to do is look at marathoners, particularly elite marathoners who have bloody diarrhea at mile 25, to realize that something dramatically wrong is happening at the gut level, where the gut's become ischemic because all the blood's been shifted away from the gut. And our experience in cardiac surgery actually taught me years ago that when you put someone on a heart-lung machine and change their circulation, even temporarily, that a good number of these people will post-operatively, despite having a perfect operation, develop pancreatitis or have a profound ileus, even though we never even touched their gut. So you're right. Many of my patients who don't have a strong family history can relate a single emotional event that started all of their symptoms. One woman from Santa Barbara, it was the death of her mother about 25 years before I met her. And from that day on, she had just about every leaky gut issue you could think of. She developed Crohn's, she developed lupus, she had fibromyalgia, and it wasn't until we finally realized that that was the starting point and repaired her gut that it all went away.
That's really interesting. Now, you measure cytokines like TNF, and you notice that they're elevated. What about other cytokines like interleukin-6? Is there something unique about TNF?
TNF seems to be kind of the low-grade marker that I look for. For instance, folks with rheumatoid arthritis often have consistently elevated levels of IL-6. A few of my lupus patients and also some of my rheumatoid arthritis patients will have elevated levels of IL-17. And the kind of fun thing about these folks is that as we get lectins out of them, then all of these levels fall to normal, except their adiponectin levels stay elevated. And that's when,
why is that?
Well, again, I think adiponectin is a marker that you are probably susceptible to your gut being permeable. Now, again, whether that's because of your gut flora, whether it's because of lectins or other material, or whether there's a genetic component, I'm not smart enough to figure that out yet. But what we found is that if we eliminate lectins, let's start there, and then change the gut flora by manipulating them with polyphenols and polysaccharides, that we can then watch the inflammatory cytokine numbers go down. And the really interesting thing is when they either, because they're feeling so good or because they want to do an experiment, re-challenge with a particular lectin, then we can actually watch those TNF markers or IL-6 go right back up. I saw a woman 2 months ago who has, she started with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, but she's 57 now. And 3 years ago, we got her off of all of her meds, and she was completely symptom-free. All of her markers was up. And I said, are you doing something? And she said, no, I'm religious on the Matrix protocol, which is what I call my protocol. And I said, nah, there's something you're eating. And so we start going down the list. And I said, we talk about nuts, which are actually beans, and cashews are a bean. Mm-hmm. They're not a nut at all. And I said, are you eating any cashews? And she said, well, why do you ask? And I said, well, I'm just asking. She said, yeah, I've been on a cashew kick. In fact, I have a bag of cashews in my car that I was eating on the way over here. And I said, when did this start? She said, about a month ago. And I said, that's when we did your blood test. Look, here it is. She says, oh my gosh, you caught me eating cashews. I said, your immune system caught you eating cashews. And so we have people who will introduce 3 grape tomatoes back into their diet, and they'll pop up their TNF-alpha. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating how sensitive it's been on these tests.
Now, so the elevated TNF-alpha, and you're assuming there's also intestinal permeability. Now, my question is, I've had clients who I know are sensitive to lectins. They've done a cytokine test, and they're low on TNF. Or I know they're sensitive to lectins, and they've done an intestinal permeability test, that mannitol test. Yeah. You see, that was another question, by the way. What do you think of that gold standard test of intestinal permeability? Because it seems like people are having intestinal permeability even if they pass that test.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think? Yeah.
Because that's a really kind of end of the line test. You've really got to destroy your gut barrier for that test to be positive.
Oh my gosh. Okay, fine.
And so, if you're positive for that, my goodness.
You've got trouble.
We've got Hurricane Katrina and all the levees are down, or in South Carolina last week. But that's what that is. That's okay. There's 20 foot of water in the street. That is my opinion is a very late sensitivity test. And you're right. There are people who have, quote, normal TNF-alpha levels. But the interesting thing is, in those people, either they've been taking, for instance, a classic example is Advil or ibuprofen, or the doc has got them on some kind of Mobix or another nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory, and they'll suppress their TNF-alpha. Mm-hmm. Statin drugs will suppress TNF-alpha. Statins, as you may or may not know, work by blocking toll-like receptors. Lowering cholesterol is a side effect of statins. It has really nothing to do with how they work. All they do is hit the mute switch on toll-like receptors so that the immune system never hears the air raid siren go off. And so white cells are not called to the area of battle. That's so there's a number of people who won't have, super high TNF-alpha levels. But it's interesting, when you take lectins away from them, you actually see their supposedly normal TNF-alpha levels go down and down and down. The other thing, just while I'm thinking about it, early on in my experience, a lot of these people, particularly women, would tell me that they had almost a lifelong history of having a low white blood cell count.
Yeah.
That their white blood cells were usually in the 3,000s, maybe the high 2s, and they'd have every workup known to mankind, and they were okay, and their doctor finally told them, that's just you, well, forget about it. I think that's actually a fabulous marker for lectin-sensitive people.
That's really interesting, because that is a marker that I see very, very often, more than the TNF, is low white blood cells. And I had that myself. I was 3.9. Would that still be considered? That would be low, yeah. What would be considered, let's say, a marker to you? I generally see my clients who are lectin sensitive, they've got in the 4s, sometimes in the high 3s. Generally, sometimes in the low threes, but generally high threes, fours.
They cluster kind of in the mid threes, low fours. I've seen some, low threes, a couple in the twos. And, you'd think, just kind of thinking about it, that if somebody was being bombarded with particles that are stimulating the immune system, that you ought to see a high white count. But
exactly.
I think exactly the opposite has happened, is that the white cells have actually been marginalized out of blood vessels, and they've gone into the periintestinal fat, to the lymph nodes, where the battle is actually happening. And we know in an infection that what happens is that white cells marginalize on the surface of the endothelium and then leave the endothelium to go out. So in a perverse sort of way, a low white blood cell count tells me that white cells have already been pulled out of circulation and they're in the peri-abdominal fat where the battle is taking place.
That's really interesting. And that was actually leading up to my next question. When we were talking about TNF, I was mentioning low TNF. I was suspecting that if somebody has low TNF, these blood tests for systemic levels of TNF don't check your local levels in your gut or places where you're having the inflammation.
Well, that's very true. And, probably one of the things that all of us as clinicians have missed is, someone telling us that their gut doesn't work right. They've got a gut sense that something's wrong. At the gut level, their neurohumoral system is sending them this rather powerful message. Now, it's probably so involved there and so localized that it probably never, or could possibly never get out to a systemic level.
That's interesting. What about, let's say, CRP? Now, I think it's a bad measure, and I think it could be a good measure in a certain way. So, for example, I noticed that when I was eating lectins, my CRP was low in the conventional standards, less than 1. So it was 0.7, a high-sensitive CRP. But as I stayed away from lectins, it actually went to 0.25. And, so what do you think? So
years ago, when CRP and fibrinogen were really our only markers that, we could not get at a non-university setting, I noticed that in general, most of these people with some form of irritable bowel or fibromyalgia had high CRPs. And I actually wrote a paper, and you can Google that at the American Heart on Circulation, that elevated CRP was a marker of oral dysbiosis, and that if I had people floss every other day, that their CRPs would fall. And the reason I chose every other day is because I hate flossing. My wife flosses twice a day. She's a nut. But I figured, well, if I can make myself do it every other day, I can make patients do it. So we studied 500 patients over a 3-month period. And lo and behold, the more they flossed, the lower their CRP went. So I was really convinced that a lot of what was going on was happening in the mouth, which we now know is a rather important part of the gut. But once I had that, and I had people flossing, and I'd get their dental reports, and they don't have any deep pockets, and then there were these people who were still running, low levels of highly sensitive CRP. And lo and behold, it wasn't until inflammatory cytokines I started measuring, I went, son of a gun, these people are all lectin sensitive. And then when we took lectins away from them, that was the final straw that broke the CRP back. The problem with CRP is it's an acute phase reactant. And so if your dog scratches you, or you've got a little cough or a cold, or you got a bruise, or you just had dental work, all bets are off. But as a good screening tool, in that, let's suppose you're seeing somebody every 3 months, which is what I do. So if you've got, a chronically, elevated CRP, then you can't account for all these other, well, you didn't have a bruise that day or your dog didn't scratch you that day. So that ought to really, kick up your interest that there is something going on here. And a ton of these people, they're hypothyroid. And I learned this very early when I first started practice in restorative medicine. A lot of my patients were overweight husbands who were brought kicking and screaming by their skinny wives for me to fix them. And I always think health is a team sport. So husband-wife teams or spousal teams are perfect to team up. So I always made the wife do all the blood tests and get a complete history and physical. And the amazing thing about these skinny women was they almost all were hypothyroid. They were almost all on antidepressants. They were almost all on a stomach acid reducer. And they all had arthritis. And I'm going, that's an interesting combination. And you were the healthy one. And, you're on they had high cholesterol. Sorry. And you're the healthy one. And you're on 5 drugs. And, of course, just as an aside, almost all the women would say, well, if you were married to my husband, you'd be on all these drugs, too. But the point is that these supposedly healthy, skinny women who have these little nodules of arthritis, I don't have any to show you, but on their knuckles, which they assume is normal, it was actually a sign that they were lectin sensitive. And so when I had them adapt the diet that I was using on their husbands, the first thing they'd come in and say, you're not going to believe this, but, these little hard nodules right here are shrinking. They're gone. And I said, yeah, if you didn't tell me that, I know you're not following, the program. But it is, yeah. I'm now convinced that all arthritis is from lectins. It really is.
That's really interesting. So I also get a lot of the more skinny type, skinny, anxious. So I'm assuming they're, the SSRIs, they're on SSRIs because they're anxious. Skinny, anxious, and actually have a whole post of like 20 reasons why you're thin, anxious, and have inflammatory issues. There's 2 actually transcription factors, PPAR gamma and STAT3. Lower PPAR gamma will cause you to be thinner, but have more inflammation. And STAT3, if you have more STAT3, it'll cause more inflammation, but you'll also be thinner. So there's like a few things that I've identified that has this skinny inflammation profile. And also TNF-alpha is a fat buster as well. So if they had high TNF, so that's really interesting that you noticed that as well. And I've also noticed low T3. My explanation is that it's from inflammation and oxidative stress. Do you have any insights on why people are having low T3 when they're lectin sensitive?
I think that's a good question. We also look at reverse T3 in all of our patients, and I've never been too impressed with getting reverse T3s. I've been doing it for, I don't know, maybe 8 years now, just for fun, but it's never paid off very well. But you're right. A lot of these women, and there may be 2 reasons. Number one, a lot of these women either have burned out Hashimoto's or subclinical Hashimoto's. Some of them, it's as simple, believe it or not, as replacing iodine in their diet. One of the striking things is, and over the last 10 years, everybody switched to sea salt. The only smart government mandate that was ever made is that you have to put iodine in salt. And that was the only smart recommendation they ever had. So a lot of times, just making them go get Morton salt or adding spirulina or chlorella capsules to their diet will actually pop up T3 pretty interestingly. On the other hand, there's about 20%, particularly of women, who won't convert T4 into T3. And I've gone toe-to-toe with friends who are endocrinologists in prestigious institutions, and they claim that this does not happen. And yet if you talk with any pharmacologist, they'll say, Are you crazy? About 20% of women do not have the ability to convert T4 into T3. And these are the women who, years and years ago, when all we had was Armour thyroid, which obviously is a combination of T4 and T3, that when Synthroid, synthetic levothyroxine, came out, everybody said, oh, now we have a synthetic drug, we don't have to do these crazy chopped up pig thyroid, and now this is science, and we're going to put all you women on T4 because we know T4 is the active hormone. And about 20% of these women would come back and say, I don't feel the same. And their well-meaning endocrinologists, of course, would put on their white coat and say, your T4 levels are perfectly normal, and your TSH is perfectly normal. You're crazy, and here's an SSRI. And
Right.
what was happening to these poor women was that they didn't have enough T3, free T3. And you'll often miss it when you just do a T3. And the fun thing when I started playing with this is you add 5 micrograms of Cytomel, liothyronine, or 10 micrograms. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, they're back in your office and go, that's it. I'm normal. How did you know? So you're right. T3 is still, I think, to this day, really not appreciated as an incredibly important missing piece of this hormonal puzzle. That's an indirect way of answering your question. I don't know why lectins do this. I do know from a Hashimoto's standpoint that I like the theory of molecular mimicry, and I think it explains almost everything, not only about why plants use lectins as a defense mechanism. And if you want, we can go into why, particularly since you know about TLRs and TLR4, the idea that toll-like receptors are actually looking at molecular barcodes. That's all they do. They read a barcode on proteins. And it's just like scanning your passport at the passport line or scanning a barcode in the supermarket. And all TLRs are doing are deciding whether this protein is known to you or whether it's unknown to you, or whether it matches a protein that you've had experience with in the past that is probably a bacteria or probably a virus. And that before the days of antibiotics, those would be very bad things, and you ought to inform your immune system about them.
Right. What do you think the ideal levels of T3 are? So the ranges are, I think it's picograms. I forgot the units, but I know the numbers are, every lab is different. Usually it's over 2.5. I noticed I would like mine to be over 3, and historically I've been like about 2.6, which I'm improving now. I need to, see exactly what I am now, but what are your ideal levels of free T3 and total
I guess
T3?
The idea is that the right level is the level that restores your sensation of normalcy. One of the things that happened to me, surgeons are taught not to listen to people. But luckily, my father is one of the greatest listeners of all time. He's never met a person he didn't want to listen to. And so through the years, it's beat into my head that I really ought to listen to people, and they'll tell me their story. And so the more lab tests are great, and don't get me wrong, I use them extensively, but so many times it's the subjective feeling that, okay, we've now got a normal free T3. You're at 2.5, or you're at 2.8, or you're at 3, or maybe you're at 4. And your TSH is down to 2 or maybe 1.5. Everything looks great, and yet you're still telling me that you've got some fatigue, that your hair is still kind of thin or falling out. Then all I do is say, okay, let's give you another 5-10 micrograms of T3 and report back, and let's look at your numbers. And I'll give you a great example. Actually, this week we had a gentleman in his 60s, and TSHs were always running about 5. So he's clearly, clinically hypothyroid, even though free T4 and free T3 are in the low normal range. And he's got fatigue, and doesn't want to do anything. So I say, let's play a little bit. We started with iodine, just some salt, and he felt a little bit better, but still wasn't right. I said, let me give you 25 micrograms of Synthroid. I mean, a placebo dose. And lo and behold, the next time he came in, not only was T4 higher, T3 was higher, now his TSH was down to 1 or less than 1. And it's like, 3 months apart. And I say, how you feel? He says, I feel great. And I said, you're on a placebo dose, but I got news for you. I think a lot of times we have to listen to people.
Definitely, and I think in those cases, we know that the sensitivity of T3 varies. So things like what I'm studying now is circadian rhythms and T3. So for example, certain circadian rhythm genes, they influence the sensitivity of T3, and we know that varies throughout the day. So a lot of times people with these T3 problems also have circadian rhythm problems. And you probably... and I think SIRT1 as well.
You probably know that the gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythm. And many times we're beginning to realize that the gut microbiome receives information in terms of even circulating melatonin. And they actually receive information from blue light receptors in our retina that if you're getting blue light at 11 o'clock at night, it's the middle of summer in Minnesota, and you should be eating and you should be awake. But if you're sitting in front of a computer screen or a big screen TV and getting bombarded with blue light at 11 o'clock at night, you're not only screwing up your brain melatonin, but you're probably changing the circadian rhythm of your gut flora, which is pretty cool.
That's really interesting. So I've actually heard of that. I haven't actually read research on that, but that's really interesting that you're bringing it up. And I am definitely a blue light Nazi. I definitely keep away from blue light, and that's interesting. I'm assuming that you also put emphasis.
Yeah, I mean,
on
blue
that.
light is great in the morning. It's great,
right.
Right after lunch when everybody's falling asleep, which is a story altogether. But after about 6 o'clock, particularly in the winter, you've got to put blue blockers on, or you got to put a red filter on your screens. And there's actually a great new light bulb that's come out called the Sleep Light. It's by Lighting Sciences, and it just got released, and it got a big write-up. And I actually know these guys. It's been put out for mothers because mothers not only don't sleep, but their babies, when they're feeding them, mothers usually got a light on and something. Well, they found that these babies, even red lights weren't doing it, so they invented a light that specifically emits no blue light. And it's an LED light, but it looks like a regular light bulb. And the mother can see, she can read, it doesn't wake her up, and it's like the baby's sleepwalking. It never actually wakes up, it eats and falls right back to sleep. It's really exciting, actually.
Oh, that's really interesting. I have cheaper fluorescent bulbs that block out the blue light. So I use those. Hopefully they're blocking out all of the blue light. As far as the program that you're talking about, Efflux, I actually spoke to a researcher who measured if there was blue light coming out of it, and he said that there was much less, but there still is.
Yeah, so these guys,
very interesting.
These guys are amazing scientists. They actually came about because of NASA. And on the space station, these guys, one day is like 28 minutes, something like that. And these guys, their sleep patterns were so crazy disrupted. So they worked with this company actually out of the Kennedy Space Center and Cocoa Beach, Florida, to come up with lights that you could totally eliminate the blue spectrum by using LED. And it's on the space station. And that's actually how they control sleeping patterns in the space station, with these lights.
That's interesting. Now, getting back to lectins.
An interesting aside.
Exactly. What percentage of people get better in your experience? People with autoimmune conditions, or people you suspect that are having issues with lectins. What percentage of them get better on a lectin-free diet? Or a lectin-limited diet. You can't completely get rid of lectins. Yeah.
All plant tissue have lectins in them. And particularly bitter green leaves have a lot of lectins. Let me give you the basic theory. So plants were here first. They had it really great before animals arrived because nobody wanted to eat them. And plants, quite frankly, don't want to be eaten. They have a life. And it's actually a difficult thing convincing people that plants have no desire for you to munch on them. And they particularly don't want you to eat their seeds, their babies, unless their seed happens to be coated with an impermeable shell and surrounded by fruit, and then they absolutely want you to eat them, so you'll poop their babies somewhere else. So plants, unfortunately, when animals arrive, have predators, particularly insects. And plants don't want to be eaten. They can't run, they can't fight, they can't hide, but they're chemists of incredible ability. They can turn sunlight into matter, and we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So they use chemical warfare. And the idea of the chemical warfare, if in one way or another, is to basically biohack into your computer, into your pattern matching, and convince the animal, if the animal doesn't feel well or isn't thriving, then the smart animal says, every time I eat these plant babies, my stomach hurts, or I'm not growing. I think I'll go eat something else. Plant wins, animal wins, everybody's happy. Then humans arrive. Plants to this day cannot imagine how stupid humans are, because we keep eating these things and then swallowing, 10 prescription medications. It's like Larry the Cable Guy, swallowing Prilosec OTC so he can have a corn dog. The corn is trying to convince Larry that you really shouldn't eat corn, but Larry's not smart enough to realize that. The best example of that sort of feature is, so cows are designed, like all herbivores, to basically eat grasses, ungulates. We're fantastic. Get rid of it completely. On the other hand, we've, as a species, no great ape has ever been seen eating grasses, eating grains. Occasional baboon will eat some grains, but no great ape's ever eaten grains. We have no system for interacting with the lectins of grasses. We have a pretty doggone good system. Our immune system sees lectins of leaves, tree leaves, and says, oh yeah, I know those lectins. I've known them now for 40 million years. They're a pain in the neck, but they're pretty harmless, and I really don't have to get all excited about these guys. On the other hand, imagine what happened 10,000 years ago when we started interacting with the lectins of grasses, which we had never, ever seen. And now, all of a sudden, you don't even have a gut flora that's adapted to grass lectins, but your immune system has never seen these things. So it's all of a sudden, it's like, you got to call Donald Trump and put up the largest wall a beautiful wall. It's going to be the most magnificent wall. And so if you kind of think of it from that standpoint, it makes a whole lot of sense why we were 6 feet tall, men and women, 10,000 years ago. Our brain was actually 15% bigger than it is today. By 8,000 years ago, 2,000 years into agriculture, of arthritis found in a human skeleton prior to agriculture. And all cultures that use agriculture, except the cultures that have a very lectin-limited diet, and we can get into that, have arthritis.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did they do, let's say, 10,000 years ago, or let's say 5,000 years ago? I'm assuming these problems were not nearly as prevalent as they are today, or do you think they were and we just didn't study them? What's your opinion?
And I actually think this is probably heresy, but if you've got people who you no longer can go hunter and gatherer, if we were hunter and gatherers now, none of us would have dogs because we would have eaten them, long before now. But so grains and beans, you have to have some storageable form of food. Otherwise, you have to wander for food. And so it's impractical to do that. At the same time, every study has shown that humans suffered immensely. We dropped in stature, our illnesses increased. Why would you do that? Well, I actually think that the priest class was essential to convince people that these new foods were manna from heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. If I have a priest telling me that, or some form of religious figure who gets all his messages from a higher power, then even though I have severe arthritis and I've now shrunk a foot compared to my father, and that boy, thank God that God gave us this, because the priest says this is manna from heaven, and there's nothing like a good Bill Maher to come along and say, I'm not sure that manna from heaven was such a good idea. So
right. What percentage, in your opinion, of the population is lectin sensitive? Do you think everyone is, and some people are just more, and some people are less affected?
Yeah, let me give you a great example. Yes, I think everybody is sensitive to them. I think depending on how your gut flora has evolved to handle lectins, how your gut flora teaches your immune system about whether they should stand down and just kind of chill out, or whether they should just get hyper excited. And I digress, but so if we think of our quote normal gut flora as 5 pounds of guys sitting around singing Kumbaya, campfire on the beach, and we've got patrol cars kind of going by and say, oh yeah, those are great kids, I know their mothers and fathers, fine families, they're not going to get into any trouble tonight, let's let them be. So imagine a couple of gang members move into your neighborhood. Now, how those gang members got there we can talk about, but they got there. Now all of a sudden you're putting up bars on the windows, you've got gated communities, and you've got a neighborhood watch patrol that are shooting guys with hoodies without asking questions. And so that's the difference. You can have a gut flora that educates our immune system that, hey, things are great here, just calm down and got it under control. Or you've got a couple of gang members, and now all of a sudden your immune system is on high alert. You've scrambled the fighter jets. You've gone to threat level 4. Your TNF-alpha is up. Your HSCRP is informing your liver to watch out for bad guys coming out of your gut. And now we're shooting to kill. And so where in that spectrum everybody falls, clearly there's a piece of genetics in some people. But clearly it may be something as simple as Roundup being sprayed on non-GMO foods to harvest them, and we can get into that story. So it's multifactorial. But yeah, I think everybody's sensitive to lectins. one of the other reasons I got interested in lectins is that years ago I took more of a low-carb approach, very much like Ron Rosedale. If you know his work, he's a huge defender that low T3 is an amazingly good sign that you're eating a ketogenic diet, and that if you don't have a low T3, you're not eating a ketogenic diet, which the logic escapes me. And
do you eat a ketogenic diet or not?
I eat.
You don't.
I
okay.
do. I do a lot of intermittent fasting. I think what I try to do is actually limit the time food is being digested. If you think about it, number one, digestion is expensive. Number two, it's during digestion that you have to open the borders to get food into you. And we know that every time you eat, your body is flooded with billions of lipopolysaccharides, little pieces of shit. Every time you eat, no matter what you eat. So logically, that doesn't seem like a very good idea to me. And, you really have to look at what we assume our ancestors did, and also current hunter-gatherers. They're not sitting around snacking all day. They're hunter-gathering, and then they come back and eat. And, they may not eat for another 2 days. And the idea that we crawled out of a cave and said, "What's for breakfast?" is just the most ludicrous thing. We didn't have refrigeration until 100 years ago. And don't get me started.
Okay, now, can you, now, since you're the only one that has done a human study that I've seen on lectins, can you tell me about this 800-person study, I believe, that you did on? You didn't publish it yet, right? Or you only presented it as a paper? I presented it
at the American Heart Association, and quite frankly, I'm so busy finishing my second book that's down the line. Because for instance, next week I'm going to the Targeting Microbiota meeting in Paris at the Institut Pasteur, and we're going to show that limiting lectins dramatically improves arterial flexibility, determined by plethysmography. And it's pretty exciting because you can actually reintroduce lectins and show that the arteries get stiff, and then take lectins out for a month and show that the arteries become flexible again.
That's really interesting. What do you think about this plant-based, whole food plant-based diet that's rich in lectins? And they, in their studies, Campbell, I actually interviewed him. But what do you think of this whole group that they show? And they've done studies. They show that, I would say the only thing that they really show is for heart disease. What do you make of that seeming contradiction between, higher lectins but lower fat? How do you make
that's a great question. I have a lot of T. Colin Campbell and Ornish and Esselstyn failures in my prep who have progressed their heart disease. And you'll actually notice that Ornish and T. Colin Campbell and Esselstyn have never published a study of arterial reversal except for 6 patients in Esselstyn's group and 6 patients in Ornish's group.
And they were probably a selected bunch. They were like, "Oh, you're doing well. Let's let's make a study."
50% of Esselstyn's group kicked out because they couldn't do the diet, and 50% of Ornish's group kicked out because they couldn't do the diet. The problem with this is we, number one, weren't designed to eat these foods. Number two, if you look at the China study, now the China study was done by the Chinese government. It wasn't done by T. Colin Campbell.
Right.
So that data is available for everyone to analyze. And what T. Colin Campbell did was what's called univariate analysis. He wanted to prove a point that animal protein's really evil. That's the point he wanted to prove. So all he did was look at animal protein consumption.
Right.
One variable. And he based all his conclusions on that. Well, there was a huge fan of his called Denise
Minger.
Minger, thank you. Who writes the Raw Food SOS blog. And Denise was such a huge fan. She was a raw foodist that she wanted to prove how correct he was by using multivariate analysis. So she took the raw data and put it through linear regression multivariate analysis. And I don't have to tell you, but what she found was exactly the opposite of what he found.
Right.
That the animal protein was actually a confounding variable because people in the South who were eating a lot of fish had a ton of liver flukes that were causing them to die prematurely because of cirrhosis of the liver. But the most telling part of the data was that if you looked at the grains that were consumed, the people in the North have a wheat-based diet and the people in the South have a rice-based diet. And incidentally, the rice is white rice. It's not brown rice, and we can get into that. The people in the North, if you solve for the type of grain, have much higher incidence of heart disease by eating wheat than the people in the South who ate rice. So it actually profoundly changed her, and if you remember, she got into warfare with T. Colin Campbell writing blog against blog. And she actually stopped being a raw vegan and kind of became a disciple of Mark Sisson.
Right.
But so the problem with these things is I like to look at the Kittavans. Do you know about the Kittavans?
Yeah. They're in Africa or something. They have a
no. The Kittavans are in the South Pacific. They're island.
Oh, okay, yeah. The Kittavans or something. Yeah.
So these guys are fascinating. They have basically no medical care, but they've been studied extensively, and they smoke like fiends. About 95% of them smoke. And they all live into their mid-90s with basically no medical care. There has never been a documented case of coronary artery disease or a stroke in a Kittavan.
Uh-huh.
And one of the leading theorists in that is that one of the things they don't eat is a major lectin-containing diet. Mm-hmm. Their major starch is cassava, and they cook their cassava. Cassava has a pretty potent lectin if you don't cook it.
Right.
But cooked, it has no lectins. It's one of the lectins that can be destroyed by cooking. There's certain lectins that can't. Wheat germ gluten can't be destroyed by heat. They eat 30% of their diet is coconut, either coconut oil or coconut.
Right.
And then they eat some fish and some fruits and vegetables. But the thing that struck me is these guys ought to have massive heart disease, and they don't. Mm-hmm.
This is a question I get a lot. They're like, well, lectins, they're kind of digested, and you get rid of them when you cook them. What do you make of that?
It depends. It depends. There are certain lectins that clearly cannot be destroyed without a pressure cooker. And I have a number of vegans and vegetarians, because of my proximity to Loma Linda University, mm-hmm. that will not, give up for either religious or moral reasons veganism, even though I can convince them that it's killing them. So, I've never seen sicker people than vegans who aren't taking some form of DHA supplement. But anyhow, what we do with those folks is we make them use a pressure cooker to cook everything. And they'll do fine if they use a pressure cooker. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a great example. I have a lovely nurse up in the Seattle area who flies down to see me a couple times a year. Horrible chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia for most of her life. She's in her 50s now. And she also has a farm. And one of her favorite foods of all time is tomatoes and zucchini. And she makes this tomato and zucchini relish that she cans. And so we took away her tomatoes and zucchini, and among other things, she She got cured of her fibromyalgia, her chronic fatigue went away. And she says, look, I really, really miss my zucchini and tomato relish. What are we going to do about this? And I said, I'll tell you what. Why don't we do an experiment? Why don't you, why don't you make your zucchini and tomato relish and can half of it the normal way and can the other half in a pressure cooker. And let's see what happens. So she calls me up about 2 weeks later. She says, you're not going to believe this. My normal canned tomato and zucchini relish, I just feel awful. It's like somebody threw a bomb in me. I ached all over. And she said, I let myself recover for a couple days. Then I dove into the pressure cook stuff. No problem. The pressure cooker was the key.
So what if somebody does a pressure cooker, then is that still a problem, or there's still lectins in there?
No, the lectins are destroyed. A pressure cooker is the only known way to break the lectin protein.
So why don't you suggest people can eat lectins just through a pressure cooker?
I do.
Oh, you do? So do you eat lectins through a pressure cooker?
No. Why would I eat something that I was never designed to eat, and that only became a food 10,000 years ago? That doesn't make any sense to me.
But they're not in there. The bad lectins are not in there.
There's still plenty of other things. There's plenty of phytates. Remember, beans are so dangerous that the federal government requires all canned beans to be pressure cooked. Mm-hmm. It's the only requirement for pressure cooking of any canned good. You have to pressure cook canned beans.
So I'm still sensitive to canned beans, and they're pressure cooked. What does that mean? That there's something else beside lectins that I'm sensitive to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're just beginning to crack the surface of these proteins because nobody's really been interested in them. And there's probably, I'll give you my estimation is that most people who think they're sensitive to gluten actually aren't sensitive to gluten. They're actually sensitive
to wheat
gluten's
germ
a
agglutinin.
to the lectins.
Right.
They're sensitive to wheat germ agglutinin
Exactly.
or the other lectins.
I have the same theory. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, nobody was sick when we were eating Wonder Bread when I was growing up. If you think about it, for 10,000 years we've been trying to make bread white.
Right.
Only the poor people got the brown bread because the brown bread had the whole bran in it. And we were throwing away the bran. It's the same way. The best argument I have for anyone who doesn't understand lectins is you look at white rice. 5 billion people use rice as their staple. Right. If brown rice was so good for you, then how come 5 billion people go to the trouble of taking the hull off of rice and throwing it away and eat it white, which is devoid of nutrients?
Let me play devil's advocate. How about there are studies on whole grains that they're beneficial for certain aspects of health. How would you interpret those studies if the whole grains have more lectins?
I don't have a problem with whole grains in an isolated culture that has not been on antibiotics their entire life, that the grains have not been sprayed with glyphosate. And that's taking everything out of context. Plus, the vast majority of whole grain studies are done in rodents. And I got news for you. Rodents are grain predators. They have a completely different ecosystem to deal with lectins. That's their favorite predated food.
What about, I don't know of any specifics because I haven't looked into this for a long time, but I think there may be some studies looking at populations who are eating whole grains for certain cohorts.
Yeah.
Do those studies come that they have more health benefits or lower health benefits? I don't know.
It's interesting. Those studies actually show that those people have a high incidence of arthritis. I'll give you an example. The Sardinians are some of the longest living people. Incredibly healthy lifestyle, and they're held up high, and they point to the Sardinians and say, look, they eat grain, and they eat beans. And it's interesting, the Sardinians have the highest incidence of autoimmune disease of any Italian population.
Right.
So you go, well, isn't that interesting? All that healthy beans and grains that they're eating. So there's pro and con to all of these things.
The Romans used to look at legumes as spiritually polluting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, beans don't like us. 5 raw kidney beans or 5 raw black beans will kill you within 5 minutes by agglutinating your blood. Ricin, the famous white poison that you send to your elected official, is the lectin of the castor bean.
Right.
And a couple molecules of ricin will kill you. Plants don't like us, and they've armed their babies to the tooth.
What do you think? Yeah. What do you think of? You mentioned lectins in the blood. What do you think of Dr. D'Adamo, who has his lectin? Now, there's no studies on it whatsoever, but do you have any take on it?
Well, my original thinking about that was that he set up a paper tiger to knock it down, because the vast majority of people are type O.
Right.
And isn't it interesting that, of course, his type O diet is the best-selling one and is, in a way, the easiest to do to manipulate things. But there's been a couple of recent papers, and I can't tell you where to find them right now. It's up in my peripheral brain in the computer, that show that enterocytes have blood group antigens detection on them. Mm-hmm. So I want to give him his due. He actually may be far ahead of just everybody thinks he's crazy wacko chiropractor. And I have a great respect for crazy wacko chiropractors, I really do. But he may be onto something here. And I don't think there's enough information yet. But, my whole next book is about pattern receptors and pattern matching and how we communicate basically through pattern signals. And it's the same thing with lectins in the thyroid. Lectins look remarkably like thyroid proteins. They look remarkably like the synovial tissue of joints. They look remarkably like myelin sheaths, and so on and so forth. And if you've stimulated your immune system, and then your immune system, if you will, has scrambled the fighter jets, and your white cells are roaming your body, and they come across your thyroid, and they go, oh my gosh, this poor woman or this poor guy, his thyroid is covered with lectins. We should shoot to kill. We shouldn't ask questions. We need to surprise them. And so it's basically friendly fire. And if you kind of think about how we bombed Doctors Without Borders a couple of weeks ago, it's like, what are you doing shooting at me? I'm a thyroid, for crying out loud. Oh, no, you're not. You're a lectin. And I think that's how plants have designed this. I think, plants have had 4 billion years to figure this stuff out. And people go, well, plants can't think. Well, they don't think like we supposedly think, but probably our bacteria are doing most of our thinking. So what happens is they are subject to evolutionary pressures. Right. And if they come up with a chemical formulation that makes their predator less prevalent or less effective, then that chemical formulation gets propagated and everybody wins, except their predator.
Now, let's say somebody comes to you and says, I tried avoiding lectins for 2 weeks. I know your study was you had them on a lectin avoidance diet for 6 months.
Right.
Now, how long does someone have to be on a lectin avoidance diet in order to notice, or in order for their markers to change, or in order for something to change?
When I was young and naive, I used to think you could change this around in a couple of weeks. I'm still naive, but I guess I'm not young anymore. But what happens is that everybody's got a degree of damage in their gut, whether it's because their gut flora is totally deranged. We know from the Human Microbiome Project that one round of antibiotics can pretty much decimate your bacterial flora for 2 years. Mm. And what people have to understand is that this is a complex ecosystem within us, and it's kind of like an Amazon rainforest. And if we think we drop napalm on this rainforest and burn it to the ground with antibiotics, which is what we're doing, it's really naive to think that in 2 weeks with prebiotics and probiotics, we're going to have a rainforest again. No, you're going to have a few populations that start to grow, and then they have to intermingle.
Right.
So I've seen some people it's taken a year to seal their gut or to reestablish their rainforest. On the other hand, I'll give you an example from this week. A very wealthy individual from the East Coast contacted me because of a friend who we had cured their Crohn's. And this person is about 60 years old, and I've never met her, just Skyped with her. She's been on the SCD diet,
right,
and has been eating basically pureed peas and pureed corn every day for about 2 years. And her colitis has gotten worse, and she's on prednisone enemas and butyrate enemas and 2 Crohn's meds. And she's got bleeding out of her gut, and so she's desperate. She said, "I've done everything. The SCD diet was supposed to cure me, and There's no word, and it's no better." So I actually just talked to her this morning. She's been on the program for 2 weeks, and was incredibly skeptical, as anyone would be with a chronic illness. And I talked to her this morning. She said, "You're not going to believe this, but this is the best 7 days of my life that I can remember." And I said, "It's a difference, don't you?" And she said, "Oh, yeah. She said, I don't know. This is maybe all placebo." And I'll tell you a funny placebo story if we have the time.
I want to know more about this study that you did. And in particular, there's a few questions that pop up, such as,
Sure.
Which autoimmune conditions did you know the greatest benefit from when they stayed away from lectins? And also, I'm curious how you selected the foods, which you did in the diet. How did you figure out which foods were the worst?
Well, I actually started years ago with my first book. That diet that you see in the Matrix was actually the original diet that I designed. And when Random House bought my book, my editor had done all the Atkins books and all the South Beach diet books. And she looked at this diet and she said, "You are one mean, cruel bastard, and no one is going to do this." And I said, "Well, I don't care. This is the cause of all disease." And she says, "I don't care. I want to sell books. So you've got to throw me some bones." And so we spent about a year actually arguing. And I said, "I'm not going to change." She said, "Yes, you are, because we own your book. And we can do anything we want with it. Now, you want to make it the best that you possibly can, but guess what? We own your book." So the book is a compromise. There's autoimmune people in that book because they were actually following the Matrix. We don't mention that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So when the book came out, a lot of people with autoimmune disease started coming. And I said, "I know what this is, so I'm going to put you on my original diet." I actually started searching lectins, and there's not a whole lot out there.
No.
And then I started doing some fascinating things. For instance, I started looking at people who had their tonsils out. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, a ton of people with autoimmune disease have had their tonsils out. And if you think about it, the tonsils are basically the 2 fortresses that guard your harbor. Mm-hmm. And they're the initial place where lectins are met. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that mucus is a mucopolysaccharide, and lectins' target are sugar molecules. That's what lectins bind to. Mm-hmm. So mucus production is actually designed to trap lectins. It's not there for any other purpose, because nothing else is going to get trapped in it. So when you start interviewing people, did you have a lot of tonsillitis growing up? Did you have a lot of postnasal drip? Did you have sinusitis? all of a sudden all these people pop up. And so tonsillitis and a tonsillectomy are a big marker for these people. I had terrible tonsillitis, but my parents saved my tonsils. But in my teens and 20s, I had these little, you ever heard of tonsillis?
No.
They're little white rocks that appear on your tonsils, and you kind of edge them out of your tonsils. And I didn't know what they were. They're actually bunches of dead white cells and lectins. And when I started asking people if they ever had any of these little hard white rocks that popped out of the tonsils who had autoimmune diseases, they say, yeah, I never knew what those were. I said, well, neither did I. But this is another marker of how important our immune system is. And we have a ton of people with chronic sinus congestion who've had drainage. Their sinuses clear up once we take lectins out, because you no longer have a reason to pump out mucus.
Okay, that's interesting. What about, let's say, cancer and lectins? So we know that lectins are anti-cancer. What's your take on that? But we also know inflammation will cause cancer, so...
Yeah, I actually think it's the other way around. I think once you... I'll give you another good example. We track a really nice marker called colon sentry, which looks at the activation of about 8 genes that are associated with colon cancer. And it gives us a score. It's off of a blood test. And we repeat that score once a year. We'll do it more often if we're really worried. So we'll start with a baseline score. When we take lectins out of people's diet, their score becomes more and more and more negative. So you're turning off more and more of these genes. If we see the score advancing, we'll have them get colonoscopy, and almost always there's at least some polyps that ought to come out. But we've been really tickled to see that these scores, just this morning we had a gentleman whose score last year was a negative 2x, twofold less risk. Now he's a negative 10-fold risk after a year of lectin avoidance. So he's gone to what's a perfect score.
Wow.
Yeah, in just a year.
That's incredible. So what percentage of your study participants, those 800 people, got cured of their autoimmune conditions after 6 months when they went on a lectin avoidance diet?
Knock on wood, we haven't seen anyone remain with an autoimmune condition on this program.
Oh, wow.
I'm sure I will, but I haven't yet.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I bet my listeners...
I'm sure I will.
Yeah, but I bet my listeners are like, well, what is this program exactly? Can you... I should have asked you this in the beginning. Could you describe your Matrix program briefly?
Yeah, so you basically want to eliminate all foods that you would have come in contact with prior to 10,000 years ago, or since 10,000 years ago. So that's all the grains, all the beans. Then you want to eliminate all foods that all of us in the United States are either European, Asian, or African ancestry. That means none of us ever encountered a lectin from North or South America until 500 years ago when Columbus started trade. All of us actually encountered Asian lectins because Asian trade and African trade and European trade was established since the beginnings of civilization, probably long before then. So it's American foods that are particularly dangerous. So that includes corn, that includes quinoa, that includes the nightshades, potatoes, eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, goji berries. Believe it or not, goji berries are American nightshade that were taken to China in trade.
I do horrible on goji berries.
Oh, yeah. That's because they're a nightshade. They're an American plant.
Right.
And chia seeds are an American plant. 2 human studies show that chia seeds promote inflammation in humans.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, I happen to not do well on chia seeds, but I don't do well on a lot of plant, like lectin.
So peanuts and cashews are American beans. They're not nuts. Sunflower and pumpkin seeds are American seeds. Terrible for lectin-sensitive people.
Okay.
The squash family, zucchinis, pumpkins, Now, in general, if you peel and de-seed, for instance, tomatoes or peppers, they're pretty safe. The lectins are primarily in the peels and seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing I'll throw in for everybody is Casein A1. 2,000 years ago, northern European cows suffered a genetic mutation. They started making a protein in their milk that's called casein capital A1. It's a very potent lectin-like substance. It's changed into beta-caseomorphine 1, which is a direct attacker of the beta cell of the pancreas. And unfortunately, northern European cows are hardier, they give more milk, so that almost all cows in the world are the wrong breed of cow, including ours. Mm-hmm. Southern European cows, goats, and sheep and water buffalo are Casein A2 producers, and they're perfectly safe. So what we ask people to do is avoid all American or Northern European or Australian or New Zealand cow milk products, even if it's grass-fed. Grass-feed does not change the fact that they make Casein A1.
Mm-hmm.
If they see a black and white cow on the label, like Irish butter, that's a Holstein. It's Casein A1. Just stay way away from it. Mm-hmm. Goat butter is safe. Goat yogurt safe. Sheep yogurt safe. In general, cheeses from France, Italy, Switzerland are the right breed of cow. Greek yogurt doesn't come from Greece. How many people don't get that? It's American cow yogurt, and just stay away from it. So it's what I've learned.
And then, let's say legumes. What about all the different kinds of legumes? And are there any grains that are in?
No grains.
No grains. Okay.
None.
Are there any fruits that are out?
Yeah, the fruits that are out. A tomato is a fruit.
Okay.
Pepper is a fruit.
Okay. But anything we think of as fruits.
Yeah, those fruits in general are pretty safe. Persimmons are actually one of the safest fruits. Mm-hmm. They're actually a resistant starch. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. Also, crispy pears, the hard kind of skinny pears, are actually a very safe fruit. There's some very interesting data that it improves gut flora, the type that you want.
Mm-hmm. All right, now the last question is regarding lectin blockers. I've experimented with lectin blockers. I've taken high dosages of various kinds. So I've done EDTA, that's been found to block lectin activity, sialic acid, N-acetylglucosamine, and mannose. Those are some of the main ones that I've tried. Yep. What do you think of taking lectin blockers? And in general, what do you think of taking lectin blockers?
Yeah, I think it's not unreasonable. Timing is probably everything.
Right.
A lot of these are basically ground up shrimp shells, and chitin is a major attractant of lectins. So you can I just tell my patients to go to Costco and buy MSM and glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate and swallow a couple of these before every meal. On the other hand, there are so many lectins in food that, again, naivety is wonderful. If you really think that this one capsule is somehow going to trap every last lectin you swallow, I've got oceanfront property in Palm Springs I want to sell you.
Right. Exactly. I've only found these to work when I've taken a really large dosage. So I have to take 10 capsules of sialic acid to really knock out all the lectins, and the reason I don't like them is because then they cause GI discomfort, and I don't know what the I don't know what the long-term effects of taking 10 capsules of sialic acid.
Right. Because it could be actually a little mischievous to some neurotransmitters. So anyhow.
Exactly. Okay, so this has been an amazing interview, and I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. Now, can you tell people the name of your books and where they can find you, or anything that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so the book, the current book out is called Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. Turn off the genes that are killing you. Mm-hmm. And the next book just got bought by HarperCollins. We don't have a name for it yet, but Matrix will probably be somewhere in the title. And it'll be out probably the holiday season of next year. That's what we're aiming for. And you can find us if you go to drgundry.com, Gundry, Gundry. You can find everything you want in there. We've got a couple of Facebook pages. Matrix, if you go to groups, you can join the Gundry Matrix group. It's an invitation-only site, and you'll be able to find the Matrix list there, and a lot of interesting people who hate lectins maybe as much as I do. Maybe more than I do.
All right, I really appreciate everything. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Hey, it's been great chatting with you, and keep up the good work. I've read some of your stuff and like it a lot.
I appreciate it. Have a great day. Thanks.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.